Samantha took a deep breath and rolled her shoulders. It had been a long night at the hospital, and she still had hours to go before her shift ended. The bright overhead lights buzzed softly as she walked through the emergency room, checking on patients. Most cases were routine: colds, minor injuries, a few cases of food poisoning. Nothing unusual. Then the doors swung open, and a paramedic rushed in, pushing an old woman in a wheelchair. The woman looked weak, her head tilted to one side. Her gray hair was messy, and her clothes were wrinkled. Her breathing was slow and shallow. Samantha walked over quickly. "What's her condition?" she asked the paramedic. "We found her alone in an abandoned house," he explained. "She seemed confused and weak, so a neighbor called us." Samantha knelt beside the woman and touched her hand. It was cold. The woman's eyes fluttered open for a second, then closed again. "What's your name?" Samantha asked gently. The woman mumbled something too soft to hear. "She hasn't said much," the paramedic added. "Just kept mumbling. We're not sure if she has family or anyone looking after her." Samantha nodded, feeling a pang of sympathy. It wasn't uncommon for elderly patients to be found alone. Some had no one left. Others were too sick to care for themselves. She reached for a thermometer, but as she got closer, something made her stop. A strange smell filled the air. It was sharp, almost like chemicals, and it made her nose sting. Samantha frowned. The ER had many smells: antiseptic, medicines, even the occasional whiff of blood. But this was different. It smelled almost metallic, but there was something else too, something she couldn't quite place. She glanced at the paramedic. "Do you smell that?" He sniffed the air and made a face. "Yeah, I noticed it in the ambulance, but I thought it was just from outside." Samantha's eyes dropped to the woman's clothing. That's when she noticed something odd. The sleeves of her old dress had faint yellow stains on them. It wasn't food or dirt. It looked like something had soaked into the fabric. Carefully, Samantha touched the woman's arm. Her skin felt slightly damp, and when she pulled her hand back, there was a thin, oily residue on her fingers. Her heart began to race. What was this? It didn't look normal. She grabbed a nearby nurse. "We need a doctor here. Now." The other nurse nodded and ran off. Samantha turned back to the woman, her mind racing. The strange smell, the yellow stains, the way the woman seemed barely conscious, it didn't add up. Then suddenly, the woman's body shuddered. Her breathing became more uneven, and her fingers twitched. Samantha's instincts screamed at her. Something was very, very wrong. Samantha's heart pounded as she watched the elderly woman tremble in the hospital bed. The strange smell in the air was stronger now, and the yellow stains on the woman's clothes still didn't make sense. She quickly grabbed a clean cloth and wiped her fingers, but the oily residue didn't come off easily. A bad feeling crept into her chest. This wasn't normal sweat or dirt. Something was wrong. Just then, Dr. Patel, a senior doctor, walked over. "What do we have here?" he asked, pulling on his gloves. Samantha explained quickly. She was found alone in an abandoned house. She's weak, confused, barely responding. And there's this strange smell. She hesitated. And these yellow stains on her skin and clothes. It's oily. I don't know what it is. Dr. Patel leaned in, frowning. He sniffed the air, then took a step back. "That's unusual," he muttered. He reached for his stethoscope and pressed it to the woman's chest. Samantha watched closely, hoping for a simple explanation. Maybe she had just fallen into something. Maybe it was nothing serious. But then, Dr. Patel's expression darkened. He lifted the woman's arm, examined the stains, and rubbed his fingers together. "This isn't just dirt," he said. "And that smell, it's chemical. I can't tell what kind, but it's not normal." Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. She had worked in the ER for years and had seen all sorts of strange cases: poisoning, infections, even chemical burns. But this felt different. Just then, the woman let out a weak, raspy cough. Her fingers twitched again, and her body shivered. Samantha turned to the monitors. Her heart rate was dropping. "She's getting worse," she said urgently. Dr. Patel nodded. "Let's get a full blood test and check for toxins. We need to know what we're dealing with." Samantha quickly grabbed the supplies and drew a sample of the woman's blood. As she worked, the chemical smell seemed to grow stronger, making her eyes water. She tried to ignore it, focusing on the patient. When she looked down again, she noticed something else. The woman's fingernails had a faint bluish tint. Her stomach clenched. Bluish nails were often a sign of oxygen problems, poisoning, or exposure to something toxic. She turned to Dr. Patel. "Her nails are turning blue." Dr. Patel's eyes widened slightly. He turned to the other nurses. "We need oxygen on her now," he ordered. "And I want her clothes removed carefully. Use gloves. Whatever this is, we don't want to spread it." A few nurses rushed to help, carefully peeling off the woman's stained dress while wearing protective gloves. As they did, the smell became almost overpowering. Samantha felt her stomach twist. This wasn't just an ordinary medical case. Something dangerous was happening, and they had no idea what they were dealing with yet. Samantha took a step back, covering her nose with her sleeve. The strange chemical smell was stronger now, filling the air around them. The other nurses were carefully removing the elderly woman's clothes, placing them in a sealed plastic bag. Dr. Patel watched closely, his face serious. "Be careful," he warned. "We don't know what we're dealing with." Samantha nodded, her heart pounding. The yellow stains weren't just on the woman's dress. They were on her arms, her neck, even on her legs. It was as if she had been covered in something. But what? The woman let out a weak cough, her breath rattling. Samantha quickly adjusted the oxygen mask over her face, hoping it would help. But something still felt wrong. One of the nurses, Emily, frowned as she examined the stains. "This isn't just dirt," she said. "It's soaked into her skin." Samantha grabbed a damp cloth and gently wiped the woman's arm. The yellowish substance didn't come off easily. Instead, it left a greasy smear on the cloth. "This doesn't make sense," Samantha muttered. She glanced at the monitor. The woman's oxygen levels were still dropping, even with the mask on. Dr. Patel's expression grew more concerned. "We need to know what this substance is," he said. "If it's something toxic, it could be making her worse." Samantha fought hard. The smell, the stains, the bluish tint on her nails. It reminded her of something, but she couldn't quite remember what. Then suddenly, a memory flashed in her mind. A few months ago, the hospital had held a special training session on hazardous materials. The instructor had talked about different chemicals that could poison a person. One of them had a strong, sharp smell, just like this one. It could seep into the skin, cause breathing problems, and even make a person collapse if they were exposed for too long. Her heart pounded as the realization hit her. "Doctor," she said quickly, "what if this is chemical exposure? What if she came into contact with something dangerous?" Dr. Patel's eyes widened. "That would explain a lot," he said. "But what kind of chemical?" Samantha shook her head. "I don't know yet, but if it's something toxic, it could be affecting all of us." The room fell silent. For the first time, Samantha noticed that her own skin felt slightly tingly. Was it just her imagination, or had the chemical spread into the air? Dr. Patel didn't waste a second. "We need to call for emergency backup," he said firmly. "If this is a hazardous substance, we can't take any chances." Samantha grabbed the hospital phone and dialed quickly. As she spoke to the emergency response team, she glanced back at the elderly woman lying still on the hospital bed. Who was she? And what had she been exposed to? One thing was clear: this was no ordinary case, and time was running out. Samantha hung up the phone, her hands trembling slightly. The emergency response team was on their way, but she wasn't sure if they would make it in time. The elderly woman's condition was getting worse by the second. Dr. Patel was already giving instructions to the team. "We need to move fast," he said. Keep monitoring her oxygen levels and watch for any new symptoms. Samantha turned back to the woman. Her breathing was more shallow now, her chest barely rising and falling. The oxygen mask didn't seem to be helping much. Her pulse is dropping, Emily, the other nurse, said urgently. She was checking the woman's wrist, her face pale. It's getting weaker. Samantha swallowed hard. They were losing her. She grabbed the woman's arm again, pressing 2 fingers against the thin skin. The yellow stains were still there, oily and unnatural. The woman's fingers twitched slightly at her touch, but she didn't wake up. Samantha's mind raced. What else could they do? They still didn't know exactly what she had been exposed to. The doctors had started a general treatment for poisoning, but was it enough? Then something new happened, something that made Samantha's stomach drop. The woman's hands, already weak, began to curl inwards. Her muscles tensed, and her body gave a small, uncontrollable jerk. She's seizing, Dr. Patel said quickly. Get the crash cart ready. Samantha rushed to the nearby cabinet, grabbing the necessary supplies. Her hands moved automatically. But inside, panic was creeping in. The woman was slipping away fast. As Dr. Patel and the nurses worked to stabilize her, Samantha noticed something else. Her own fingers were tingling. It wasn't strong, just a faint prickling sensation. She looked up, locking eyes with Emily. The other nurse's expression told her everything. She was feeling it too. The realization sent a jolt of fear through Samantha. If the chemical was affecting them, how bad was it? Before she could say anything, the ER doors burst open. The emergency response team had arrived. 4 people in protective suits rushed in, carrying special equipment. One of them, a man with a radio clipped to his chest, stepped forward. We need to clear this area, he said. Now. Samantha hesitated for only a second before nodding. Whatever was happening, they had to trust the experts. As they stepped back, letting the hazmat team take over, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling in her gut. This wasn't just a medical emergency. This was something bigger, and they still had no idea what they were dealing with. Samantha watched as the emergency response team moved quickly, their protective suits rustling as they surrounded the elderly woman. Their leader, a tall man with a radio, gestured toward the sealed plastic bag containing the woman's stained clothes. We need to test this immediately, he said to his team. One of them carefully lifted the bag and placed it into a special container. Another took a sample from the woman's skin using a cotton swab, sealing it inside a small vial. Samantha's heart pounded. What was on her? Was it dangerous? Dr. Patel stepped forward. Her condition is worsening, he told them. We need to know what's causing this. The man with the radio nodded. We have a suspicion, he said, but we need to confirm it. Samantha frowned. What do you mean? The man turned to her. Have you heard of phosphine gas? Samantha's stomach clenched. She had heard of it during her hospital training. Phosphine was a deadly gas, often used as a pesticide. It could seep into the air from chemicals or old storage containers. If inhaled, it could cause confusion, weakness, breathing problems, exactly what the elderly woman was experiencing. Dr. Patel's face darkened. Are you saying she was exposed to phosphine? We're not sure yet, the man said, but the yellow stains, the smell, and the symptoms all match. Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. If the woman had been near phosphine, she could have been breathing in poison for hours. And worse, so had they. She glanced at Emily, the other nurse, who was rubbing her hands together nervously. I've been feeling a slight tingling, Emily admitted, like my fingers are going numb. Samantha looked down at her own hands. The sensation was still there, faint, but real. Dr. Patel noticed too. We need to check the staff for exposure, he said firmly. If this gas is in the hospital, it's a serious risk. The emergency response team reacted immediately. Everyone who has been near the patient needs to be examined, the leader said. Let's move quickly. Samantha swallowed hard. The situation was worse than she thought. Not only was the elderly woman in danger, but so was everyone else in the ER. Samantha felt her heart race as the emergency response team moved into action. The thought of a deadly gas spreading in the ER sent chills through her. If phosphine gas was truly the cause, they had all been exposed, and time was running out. The team leader turned to the hospital staff. "We need everyone who's been near the patient to be checked immediately," he ordered. "If anyone feels dizzy, weak, or short of breath, report it now." Samantha glanced at Emily, who was still rubbing her hands nervously. "I feel a little numbness," Emily admitted, her voice shaky. Samantha nodded. "Me too," she said. "And I smelled that chemical odor the moment I got close to her." Dr. Patel stepped forward. "We need to evacuate this area and move unaffected patients to safety." The emergency team acted fast. Some workers set up a testing station in an empty room nearby, while others checked the hospital's ventilation system to make sure the gas wasn't spreading. Samantha's mind was spinning. She had seen a lot of emergencies, but this was different. This wasn't just a sick patient. This was a possible chemical contamination. As she stepped toward the testing area, she noticed the elderly woman still lying on the hospital bed, barely moving. The hazmat team was handling her with extreme care, making sure no further exposure occurred. Samantha felt a pang of sympathy. Who was she? Where had she been? How had she ended up covered in a dangerous chemical? Then a sudden thought hit her. "What if there are others?" she asked aloud. Dr. Patel turned to her. "What do you mean? What if this woman wasn't alone?" Samantha said, "If she was found in an abandoned house, what if there were other people there, people who might also be exposed?" The emergency team leader's expression hardened. He reached for his radio. "We need to alert local authorities," he said. "They need to check that area immediately." Samantha's chest tightened. If there were more victims out there, they might not have much time. And if the source of the poison was still leaking, more lives could be in danger. Samantha watched as the emergency team moved quickly. The hospital staff who had been near the elderly woman, including herself and Emily, were now being tested for exposure. A special machine checked their oxygen levels and any signs of poisoning. Emily gave Samantha a nervous glance. "Do you think we'll be okay?" Samantha took a deep breath. "I hope so." Her hands still had a slight tingling feeling, but it hadn't gotten worse. She hoped that meant she hadn't absorbed too much of the chemical. Meanwhile, the emergency response team leader was speaking into his radio. "We need a team to investigate the house where the patient was found. There could be more people exposed to the chemical." Dr. Patel nodded. "And we need to stabilize her fast." The elderly woman was still unconscious, her breathing shallow. The doctors were doing everything they could to remove any toxins from her system, but without knowing exactly how much she had been exposed to, it was hard to tell if she would survive. One of the emergency workers returned with urgent news. "We tested her clothes," he said. "It's confirmed. There are traces of phosphine gas." Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. It was true. The woman had been poisoned. The team leader's expression grew serious. "Phosphine is highly dangerous. If she was in a place where it was leaking, there could be more victims." Samantha's heart pounded. What if there were other elderly people trapped in that house, unable to escape? What if someone else was out there, breathing in the poison right now? "We need to act fast," Dr. Patel said. Samantha could see it in everyone's eyes. They knew time was running out. Would the emergency team reach the house in time? And would they find more victims before it was too late? Samantha paced nervously in the hospital hallway, waiting for news. The elderly woman was still unconscious, and the emergency response team had rushed to the abandoned house to check for more victims. Every second felt like an eternity. Emily stood beside her, arms crossed. "I can't stop thinking about it," she murmured. How did she end up covered in that chemical? Was it an accident? Or something worse? Samantha shook her head. "I don't know, but I have a feeling we'll find out soon." Just then, the emergency team leader returned, his protective suit slightly dusty. He looked serious. "We found something." Samantha and Emily exchanged a glance. "What?" The man took a deep breath. "There was no one else in the house," he said, "but we discovered open containers of old pesticide in the basement. It looks like the woman had been living there for a while. Maybe she didn't know the chemicals were leaking." Samantha felt a pang of sadness. She was homeless. The man nodded. "It seems like it. We found a small sleeping area with blankets and food. She must have been breathing in the fumes for days, maybe even weeks." Emily covered her mouth. "That's why she was so weak. She was slowly being poisoned." Dr. Patel joined them, his expression softer now. "We're doing everything we can for her," he said. "Now that we know what she was exposed to, we can treat her properly." Samantha let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "So she has a chance." Dr. Petal gave a small nod. "It won't be easy, but yes, she has a chance." Relief washed over Samantha, but at the same time, her heart ached for the woman. No one should have to live in such dangerous conditions. A few hours later, Samantha checked on the patient. The elderly woman was still weak, but her breathing was more stable. She wasn't out of danger yet, but at least she had a fighting chance. As Samantha adjusted the woman's blankets, the elderly woman's eyelids fluttered. Then, slowly, she opened her eyes. Samantha gasped softly. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The woman's lips parted, her voice barely a whisper. "Where am I?" Tears pricked Samantha's eyes. "You're safe," she said gently. "You're in the hospital. We're taking care of you." The woman's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, Samantha saw something in them: gratitude. She had been saved, and Samantha knew, in that moment, that everything they had done had been worth it.